Hey everyone, Owen here, and today we're going to be talking about politics, specifically internet video game politics. Before the video, I'd like to lay out a guideline. I will not be talking in any capacity about Zoe Quinn, Anita Sarkeesian, The Quartering, Sargon of Akkad, Geeks and Gamers, or any of the personalities involved in this discussion. All too often, I see discussions of these topics become discussions of these people, and while I do think that discussion of the people who propagate ideas is important, lots of people have had those discussions in much more eloquent and nuanced ways than I could, and often discussions of these personalities come at the expense of discussion of the actual ideas they're talking about, so we're going to avoid that if at all possible. As would follow from that, I also won't be discussing Gamergate or any of the related or similar controversies, as they all have largely become impossible to separate from the personalities who they were led by or focused around. It has, in recent years, become a popular position to hold that video games, and more widely culture, have over the past decade developed in a direction that is more, in the most popular term, political. If you have any familiarity with this issue, I'm sure you're well aware of the fact that wrapped up within it is a very complicated web of conflicting accounts of events, ideals, definitions, and philosophies, and so today we're going to try and peel back the layers of this issue and take a look at the underlying conflict, make some sense of this as a whole, hopefully provide the resources for you to think more critically about it, and maybe even recontextualize this debate as a whole. So, point by point, we're going to be asking what politics even are, should, and if so when should we be criticizing our games, what is forced diversity, and finally, who killed Hideo Kojima. Now, with all of that out of the way, it's time to sit back, relax, and have a nice chat about politics. As I alluded to earlier, since about 2014, the year an event we won't be talking about occurred, it has been a consistently popular opinion to take up that video games, and now media in general, have become more politicized. But when I said that earlier, I didn't exactly explain how. Well, politics isn't exactly perhaps the word we're looking for, if we're trying to describe the specific thing that people take issue with. Sometimes interchangeably used are the terms SJW politics, woke politics, political correctness, or virtue signaling, which narrows it down somewhat, but still leaves us with words that are at best unspecific and subject to interpretation, depending on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. Those words could be practically synonymous or describing entirely different things. And at worst, buzzwords that have been rendered largely, while not meaningless, unhelpful for describing a nuanced subject. However, for the sake of having something to call this, I'm going to say liberal politics, in the American sense of socially conscious but largely neoliberal capitalist politics, because that's mostly as far left as you're going in games produced by major corporations with a profit incentive. I want to emphasize that because I want it to be very clear that the politics we're talking about here are not radical leftist politics. There are no games coming out of major developers today that espouse Marxist-Leninist propaganda. What we're talking about here is at most extreme center-left politics, ideas today largely becoming status quo politics in much of the world. But I keep skirting around the politics being discussed, so what actually are these politics? Well, it depends. It could be inclusion of minority characters, be that racial, sexual, gender, etc. Empowerment of these characters, either through their being literally powerful within the context of the game, or through explicit reference to their pride in their identity. Inclusion of minority characters without explicit reference to their minority status and utilization of that within the plot of the game. Explicit reference to their minority status and utilization of that within the plot of the game, and dozens upon dozens more than that. And while there are some specific and glaring inconsistencies in this kind of view of politics and political speech, some of which were unavoidable to mention just now and some of which I will discuss later, for now, for the sake of analyzing their most basic claim, I'm going to take a position of an assumption that anti-SJWism and anti-feminism are basically consistent ideologies that operate from a point of consistent reasoning. Depending on who you ask, people could believe practically none of the previously mentioned things, half of them or all of them, and all of these people could still consider themselves to be a part of the same basic movement. There isn't going to be an easy list of complaints or attributes you can make for people who have this view of media, so the most important thing to know, and the only thing necessary to invalidate their arguments, is that their basic definition of politics is something which diverges from the status quo, specifically to the left. And that bit about the left is especially important. You don't see the people who wish games weren't so political up in arms when games, say, include homophobic humor, intentional or unintentional racism or sexism, or any number of other things that diverge from the status quo to the right, or are consistent with it. But even disregarding the fact that this claim of games being too political is not levied equally towards both sides, I'd like to actually tackle the argument of whether these progressive inclusions or ideas in games are politics. While the knee-jerk response to this is oftentimes, understandably, to suggest that things such as diversity and decisions made with inclusivity in mind aren't political, this is actually one of the places where the anti-SJWs and anti-feminists are right. These are political actions. Choosing to have pronoun options rather than gender ones in a character creator is a political decision. Choosing to include gay romance options is political. Choosing to include racial minority characters is political. Where they're wrong is to act as if these are in some way uniquely political, more so than right-wing politics or adherence to the status quo. Contrary to how it's often viewed, choosing to stick to common sense or social normality is as political a decision as choosing to rebel against it. You're saying that you think that those commonly accepted ideals and ideas are worth upholding, and maybe that's true. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but it isn't especially important to us if these ideas are right. What's important is that these SJW politics are not in any way uniquely political. I always like to say the phrase, everything is politics, which weirdly makes a lot of people upset, or at very least makes a lot of people feel the need to debate me about it. An interesting conversation I had some time ago about this was with someone who was an enthusiast of flags, and in passing conversation about looking at a flag apolitically, I said that that wasn't really possible, because even if you set out to examine a flag without considering politics, say looking at the flag of the Nazi Party for the sake of critique of its design, the decision to try and distance yourself from politics is in itself a political decision. You're choosing to say that for whatever reason, right or wrong, at that moment you don't consider it to be relevant to what you're doing to consider that political side of the thing. However, the person I was talking to was adamant that it was possible to consider things in a completely apolitical fashion. And, that's an attractive idea. It speaks to an idealistic idea of human rationality and thought, that given enough will and concentration, we can fully separate our actions from so-called politics. But that's not really how we work, is it? We aren't perfect rhetoric robots, no one is. And so saying that you can be perfectly apolitical is like saying that you can be perfectly objective or rational. It's simply not possible. In the same way that every decision you ever make will be influenced by the circumstances of your life, every decision you ever make will be political. If we think about politics exclusively as something pertaining to the governance of a country, sure, it's fair to say that not everything is probably political. But if we think about politics in the way that is often thought of today, and as it's described by the people who criticize politicization of media, as the idea of the intersection of our culture, government, thought, and the way we make our way through the world, well then, that's everything, isn't it? In the world of opposition to politicization, if there is one thing considered more offensive than political games, it is political criticism of games. I know I said I wouldn't be discussing any personalities or controversy, but it is worth noting that the event which arguably changed gaming culture more than any other was started, no matter who you ask, though the reasons may vary, around games journalists who were criticizing games through an explicitly political lens. And, ever since, it has been, as those who are opposed to it would tell you, a war between those who are trying to deconstruct and ruin games, and those who are trying to protect them. This war, as they would tell you, is being waged in two main ways. First, through criticism of games for their portrayals of women and minority characters, and second, for their pushing for greater inclusion within games and more widely games culture. And I want to emphasize that I called this a war, because those who perceive media critics to be a threat really do stylize this as a war, one side fighting another. While I am going to go more in depth about the specifics of this situation, I'd like for a moment to make a point about how this specific idea of criticism exposes how feminism and social justice are really viewed in these circles. Simply put, if you consider this to be a war, with media critics, feminists, games journalists, and proponents of social justice on one side, and the games industry on the other, then you believe that the games industry is inherently antithetical to feminism and social justice, and that criticism of games is anti-games. The fact of the matter is, obviously, that this couldn't be further from the truth. Media criticism, which is what I'll just be referring to all of this as collectively, is not against the media it criticizes. Film critics are not anti-movies, food critics are not anti-food, art critics are not anti-art. Media criticism stems from a love of the medium and a desire to see it improve, both on a basic level of it being better written, directed, programmed, etc., but also on the more nebulous level of it being more responsible with its ideas, themes, or yes, politics. And explicitly political criticism is no different. Feminists and proponents of social justice who criticize games don't hate games. In fact, their criticism is motivated by a love for them. However, the gaming community's belief that the ideals of those who criticize games are incompatible with games has led them to believe that they are attempting some sort of a malicious attack. But, some of you might be saying, the problems we take aren't with the ideals of the critics, it's with their actions. And sure, maybe some people feel that way, and maybe that was once the case, but if you examine the controversies and general sentiments in the gaming community in the past years, it's clear that the anti-feminist and anti-SJW movements have become almost entirely divorced from the idea of opposition to specific people, and has become opposition to ideology and ideals. But let's, for the sake of argument, ignore the fact that the premise of the war between critics and games is at best deeply flawed, and examine the actual overarching issues people take with the criticism. Primarily is the idea that political criticism of games, for example saying that homophobic characters are harmful and shouldn't be included in games, is not grounded in any fact or data, and for it to be legitimate, it needs to be, quote, grounded in reality, unquote. That acting as if sexist, homophobic, transphobic, or other negative portrayals of groups in games are actually causes for people to be more sexist, homophobic, transphobic is ridiculous. But to address this idea, we don't even really need to get caught up on whether or not games really do influence how players think about those kinds of issues. I would like to propose a thought experiment of sorts. Tell me, why are racist portrayals in media bad? Well, of course there's data suggesting the negative effects it has not only on those being portrayed but also on those consuming the media, but I don't really think that matters. I highly doubt that anyone has decided racism was bad because they looked at a study like that. We don't see racist depictions of, say, black people and say that is bad because of these data points and facts, because we have decided as a society that it is harmful. So why here do we suddenly need hard facts? Of course, studies of the same sort exist for negative depictions of minority groups and women in games, but if you believe that racist depictions are bad simply based on our societal understanding that they are, as I am fairly confident is the case for most all of us, then you cannot reasonably deny these to be harmful, because if you try to, you either admit that racist depictions are not bad or that these are. A popular phrase to quote in an attempt to shut down this kind of media criticism is one that goes something like, "The only way to stop racism is to stop talking about it." And it would be an understatement to say that I am not a big fan of this idea. Making it convenient for those who do not want race to be discussed is not how we go about making ourselves conscious. This quote entirely fails to recognize that this idea of refusal to talk about race or even other social issues is exactly how groups go about enforcing racial inequality and injustice. But beyond its misunderstanding of history, this quote also once again reveals a lot about how anti-feminists and anti-SJWs think about media criticism in relation to politics. As we discussed before, to them the status quo is an apolitical concept, and so since racism is not apolitical, the status quo cannot be systemically racist, homophobic, sexist, or any number of other things, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And similarly, the idea that things will just sort themselves out if we stop worrying about them is also not an apolitical idea. History has never shown us that sitting around waiting for reform to take place will lead to that reform. Recommending we do that demonstrates either a complete lack of understanding of history, or, much more maliciously, ambivalence towards whether those goals are actually realized. And so, if there really is a war, it's not being waged on games, but by games. Defense of the status quo is not a defensive action. In many cases, it is actively offensive. Media changes with and is a reflection of culture, so active opposition to change isn't really even just a preservation of the status quo, because the status quo isn't really a static thing. A lot of people see opposition to games criticism as a matter of preserving the artistic freedom of games. And at the beginning of this, I would have said it's kind of weird to me that gamers, despite wanting their medium to be respected, so actively fight against criticism, a foundational pillar of all of our most respected art forms. But after this segment, I think it's clear that that's because they don't actually care about gaming becoming an art form, if that means a deviation from the status quo for games. They want the aesthetics of artistic legitimacy without the effort. This isn't about artistic freedom, because even if games developers choose on their own to make inclusive decisions, it's still seen as just pandering and something to be criticized. If art should have the freedom to be politically incorrect, it should also have the freedom to choose to be inclusive, and consumers of that art should have the freedom to examine and criticize art and aspects of art that they find problematic or worth discussing. So, is there a war of criticism on games? Only if you think that social justice necessitates a war against it. This next segment is about a subject that's a little difficult to talk about, and that I actually don't really feel qualified to discuss on a broad level, and that subject is diversity and tokenization. Now, it's not that I don't think that this is an incredibly fascinating and important topic to discuss. A lot of people have talked about it much better than I can. I feel like I'm going to spare all of you the experience of a white dude trying to argue with other white guys about whether non-white people can be in video games. And that's not to say that white people can't talk about this kind of thing, but that if you are a white dude talking about it, you have at least a little bit more responsibility to be very familiar with the issue, and very familiar with the perspective of the people who you're talking about. And I don't feel like I'm qualified to that degree that I should be. And also, I don't really think that it's necessary to actually talk about whether certain instances of diversity are tokenization. Let me explain. The concept of forced diversity is one really popular with the anti-SJW crowd, and I kinda touched on it in a previous segment, at least in the context of it being an incredibly inconsistent kind of idea, and that's because the concept of something being forced, when it's talked about by those groups of people, does not actually have any relation to whether or not it's being put in something in order to push something on the consumer. Diversity can be placed in a game by the developers because they thought the game needed it, just because they wanted to, or yes, to score points with people who have an interest in social justice. But even though I'd like to note that that last one is, in my experience, one of the less common reasons, what the motivations actually are doesn't have any bearing on whether the diversity is labeled forced. And that's because the label forced diversity isn't actually about whether it's being forced into the game, rather whether the audience feels it's being forced on them, and that's a very different concept. Framing it like this is good because it lets us deconstruct it as it actually is, a feeling that people have, rather than the distraction used, which is presenting it as an actual systemic issue within games development. And I want to make clear that I'm not saying that tokenization and corporate co-opting of the aesthetics of social justice aren't problems, but these aren't issues that the anti-SJWs have with diversity in media, because there is no distinction drawn between those kinds of co-opted social justice and regular inclusion. And again, where that distinction lies is a very interesting discussion, but the fact that there is even a distinction is not even really considered in a nuanced way by anti-SJWs. But back to why these people actually think that this diversity is being forced on them, and to find the answer to that, we have to come back around to the idea of the apolitical status quo, because that concept of the normal being apolitical and the abnormal uniquely political is where we'll find our answer. That idea of the apolitical center is why it's forced if there's gay romance, but not if there's a straight one. That's why it's political if there's a black lead character, but apolitical if there's a white one. That's why it's propaganda if your female characters aren't sexualized, but regular if they are. Because it violates the status quo and challenges in any way how they would view the world. It's being forced on them. And really, more specifically, it's what they think the status quo ought to be, because it's worth noting that today the status quo, in much of the West, is becoming acceptance of the LGBT+, feminism, and many moderate social causes. So it's not even what's outside of the norm, it's outside of their version of it. So not only is it not the case that diversity is uniformly or even mostly actually forced, but the entire concept is predicated on a deeply flawed idea of what forced even means. In the previous section, I touched briefly on the concept of authorial intent when discussing the gaming community's attitude towards what developers choose to put into their games. But now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, as well as about interpretation. And political interpretation is a really interesting topic here because, despite, political criticism being an incredibly important part of how we examine art, it is also similarly deeply unpopular within the gaming community. If you make a video or write an article in which you look at the underlying or implied political themes in a game, you'll be bombarded with comments and response videos about how what you're talking about is SJW crap that the developers never intended to be read into. But here's the thing, authorial intent is kind of bullshit. Now, I'm sure most of you are basically familiar with these concepts, so I'm not going to bore you. But considering we established earlier that nothing is apolitical, we can apply that here to say that nothing any author of a work decides to include can be apolitical, and thus our political interpretation of a work is an important part of our understanding of it. And because we really don't ever get to truly choose the politics of our actions, what the author says about their work doesn't have to be the only thing we can take away from it. Sure, you can choose to, say, buy vegan cheese, because you have a certain political reason to do so. Maybe you think it's healthier for you, or better for animals, or more sustainable for nature, but whatever your reason, you're making a choice because there is an outcome that you want to occur. But there are a lot of outcomes that stem from that decision that you can't exactly foresee. Maybe the manufacturing process for the cheese is actually damaging to the environment. Maybe it is based in some part on exploited immigrant labor, and maybe it costs a lot to transport. While you can maybe control one of the outcomes of your decision, it's impossible to keep all of the effects of your choice under your control. Authorial intent works very much in the same way, because you can make decisions and ascribe meaning and intent to those decisions, but just because you've said what your intent was doesn't mean that there aren't dozens and dozens of implications inherent to that decision that you aren't even aware of, much less things you actually thought critically about. Now, by now, some of you may be wondering why I named this section after acclaimed game director Hideo Kojima. And the reason there is because Hideo Kojima is one of the strangest and most notable cases today of a game developer who makes specifically and explicitly deeply political games, but whose work's political nature are almost completely ignored by the wider gaming public. I'm not going super in depth about the themes of his games, but I'll just make clear that his most notable works, the Metal Gear Solid series, which is steeped in criticism of the United States and its role in world and international politics, and Death Stranding, which Kojima himself has said to be a response to Trump and Brexit, are not coy about their politics. And yet, strangely, while being deeply critical of those who read into the political themes of games that are not explicit about it, a large subset of the gaming community chooses to overlook these themes. Why? Well, considering what we discussed earlier, just because Kojima said it doesn't mean that's how we have to interpret it, and my reading of the themes of Metal Gear Solid also might not be right. But if you think authorial intent is meaningful enough to dismiss people's readings of work, then you have to concede that what an author says about their work is what that work is about. So why don't they acknowledge that with Hideo Kojima? Well, because they don't actually care about authorial intent. Here, like earlier with talks of forced diversity, this idea of authorial intent is just a mechanism by which anti-SJWs and anti-feminists can shut down arguments without having to actually rhetorically engage with the ideas presented. Interpretation that doesn't have any relation to some highest authority, in this case the author, is a dangerous idea to them because it represents a kind of co-opting of the status quo. You can no longer act as if there is a way to be apolitical if you acknowledge the ability to interpret anything as political. Every strategy and idea we talked about in the previous section unravels if this kind of idea is acknowledged. It rejects the sentiment that anything was ever less political than it is now. It is entirely antithetical to the idea of an apolitical anything. It represents the idea to use critical thinking and action to influence change in the world, and that's what scares them the most. Hey all, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found what I had to say at least a little bit interesting. But I want to hear from you guys. Did I make a point you didn't agree with? Represent something incorrectly? Let me hear it. I'll be sure to read all the comments, and I'm very interested in what you guys have to say. Well, that's all from me. I'll see you next time.